Hi, everyone. This is a lecture, a mini lecture, as we've been doing. Um, I'm providing this today because I'm not really feeling all that great, but I do want to provide at least an asynchronous lecture. Um, this chapter is one of my favorites. It's on sexual orientation, and I want you to think about this as we go through. Um, I want you to assume this quick think here that one day researchers are able to identify the gay, lesbian, bisexual gene, and that we could now say for certain that homosexuality, bisexuality, etc., is genetic. Do you think that society would be more or less accepting of people in this community? Um, that I think is a really interesting question. I used to think personally that the answer would be yes, we'd be more accepting of people in this community. However, students have often said, and I believe that they are correct, that they think that what would happen if we could identify the quote gay gene or the GLBTQ gene, that people would then get abortions if they, could get a genetic test and it showed the child was going to be in the GLBTQ community. That some people would just simply get an abortion because they didn't want to have a child who was going to be GLBT or Q. And I think, unfortunately, that may be true. Um, Also, I want to call your attention to something that happened actually on January 22nd, but not this year. It happened on January 22nd of 2018, or sorry, 2019. The US Supreme Court ruled that Trump's ban on transgender serving in the military would be allowed to move forward while the case went its way through the court system. The Supreme Court heard that case before all of this happened earlier this year, and so we will know probably sometime in early June what the decision is on that particular case. Um, Under the ban, people already in the military who have identified as transgender would be allowed to stay. But new recruits or new people joining would not be allowed to be openly transgendered. Of course, this was something that changed right before Obama left office. And of course, there was actually support from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So it's something for us to all be aware of, that there's a lot of flex, not flex, there's a lot of movement on this issue. And just when I think that we're really making progress on equality, or at the very least equity for the GLBTQ community, we seem to take a couple steps back. So anyway, let's move on to this idea. Excuse me. Um, First off, sexual orientation. We used to say things such as sexual preference, um, but we really began to recognize, and I say we meaning society and academics, we came around to the recognition that sexual orientation is a better term because when you're oriented towards something, that means it tends to mean something that is much more natural, as opposed to sexual preference, which is the idea that people choose who they're attracted to. And it is not at all about people choosing, really. If you talk to almost anybody who identifies, or even yourself, if you're somebody who identifies as heterosexual, you probably recognize that there wasn't a day that you woke up and you thought to yourself, you know what, today's a damn good day to be heterosexual. I think I'm going to be heterosexual for the rest of my life. No one does that. No one just wakes up one morning and decides who we're going to be attracted to. It happens quite naturally, I think. You're a kid, and one day you see somebody who looks pretty hot, and you think to yourself, well, think I'd like to get a little something, something. You don't really make this conscious decision that, okay, this is who I'm going to be attracted to. Excuse me. And so um, the better term is I think, sexual orientation. Okay, so what we're talking about, of course, is that um, the gender a person is attracted to emotionally, physically, sexually, romantically, all of those things. And so the other terms there, heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, and GLBTQ, or some people say LGBTQ. Doesn't really matter which comes first, I don't think. But we're talking about the same thing there. And I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with those terms and those acronyms. Next, I want to just cover some of the ways in which researchers have tried to understand sexual orientation. And one of the oldest and best known models is that by Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey is an interesting cat because he was not a trained sexologist. In fact, during his time, there was no such thing as human sexuality as a discipline. He did all of his own research. He really was a pioneer in the field of the study of human sexuality. And today, you can actually earn a PhD in human sexuality. During his time, you couldn't. He was actually an entomologist. That's somebody who studies bugs. But he came around to studying human sexuality um, partly because many of his graduate students were married, and it was common at the time that he was teaching in the mid to late 40s, just after World War II. Many of them were young men who had married their college or high school sweethearts who'd perhaps served in the military. And if you all know, we're not really very good in this country in talking about human sexuality or sex and relationships. We're not great about that stuff. So they had a lot of questions, and long story short, he began teaching just one course about human sexuality, and it was really popular. And he started teaching another one, and then he realized, well, I don't have a whole lot of information about this topic. There's not a lot out there, so I guess I should do some research. And over 20 plus years, he did a lot of research. And so, as I said, his scale, it's known as the Kinsey scale, is widely regarded as still having a lot of merit. That is, it's still a worthwhile model. It's not a perfect model, but it is a good model. So let's take a look at it. So you see here that the Kinsey model is really a, a it's a 7-point scale. And I'll make this a little bit bigger here because, oops, wrong thing. Excuse me. I'm trying to, sorry, make it more of a slideshow so that it's bigger. There we go. All right, so you see here that he has a scale going from 0 to 6. So it's a 7-point scale. And he uses blue for heterosexual behavior and purple for homosexual behavior. And the categories there, on the one end of the spectrum, exclusively heterosexual, and on the other end of the spectrum, exclusively homosexual. And then in the middle, he's got the third stage, and that is, or the third scale, that is the equally heterosexual and equally heterosexual and equally homosexual. This is a person we would typically call bisexual. And the exclusively heterosexual is a person who, in his description, has never, identifies as heterosexual, doesn't have any fantasies about anyone other than the opposite sex, doesn't have dreams about anyone other than the opposite sex, doesn't have any lust for anyone but someone of the opposite sex. And so um, these are people who are really, really, very staunchly heterosexual. Um, on the other end of the spectrum are the exclusively homosexual. And these are people who are who've never dated anybody of the opposite sex, never had sex with someone of the opposite sex, never lusted after someone of the opposite sex, never even had a fantasy or lusted after someone of the opposite sex. Um, and what Kinsey said is that those people exist, but he believed that there were far fewer of those individuals on the outer ends of the spectrum than there were people who were more in the 1 and the 5 areas. He believed there were a lot more people in the 1 and the 5s than there were in the 0s and the 6 scale. And the 1 and the 5 are similar in that the predominance is toward one sexual orientation. So for the scale 1, it's somebody who's predominantly heterosexual, only incidentally homosexual. And what he means by that, or meant by that, is that these are people who identify as heterosexual. They date people of the opposite sex. They have relationships with people of the opposite sex. They may marry someone of the opposite sex, but they may have every now and then an attraction to someone of the same sex or a fantasy about someone of the same sex. At the 5 scale, again, these are people who are identifying as homosexual. They date others of the same sex. They have sex with others of the same sex, etc. But once again, they may from time to time have some attraction to someone of the opposite sex, maybe even have dated someone of the opposite sex, maybe even have had sex with someone of the opposite sex. And so, as I said, Kinsey believed that there were more people in 1 and 5 than there were in 0 and 6. And this is all based on his research of 20 plus years. People in 2 and 4 stages, of course, also predominantly one sexual orientation or the other, but they have more fantasies and lusts, maybe even date somebody or have some sexual activity with someone of the same sex in the case of the number 2 people and opposite sex in the case of number 4 people. And so it's a useful model because it really does suggest that sexuality, who we are attracted to romantically, physically, intimately, sexually, etc., it could be perhaps fluid. It is not necessarily all or nothing. And then we go to Klein. Klein's sexual orientation grid does try to improve upon Kinsey's model in that what Klein does is he looks at Kinsey's continuum and he thinks, well, you know what? There's something missing here. It's a good model, but there's something missing here. And what Klein does is he incorporates the concepts of the past, the present, and the ideal. And if you take a look at this grid here, you see that Klein is suggesting that who we are attracted to, who we have sex with, who the fantasies, the sexual fantasies, and who do we emotionally prefer, meaning who can we really open up to, our social preference, who do we want to be around, our self identification, how we identify, and the kind of lifestyle that we have. Those can all change over time. And so in the past, he suggests that perhaps we could be attracted to a particular sex, but in the present, maybe this sex could be the same or different. And that there's an ideal that all of us have in our heads about what kind of person we would want to be attracted to and what kind of sexual behavior we'd want to have, etc. And again, I think that this is a useful model because it really does help us to think about how our sexuality can change over time. It is not necessarily fixed in time and static and unchanging. And I think that we do see that more today with younger individuals because they're much more willing, it seems, to step outside the box that they were put into and be willing to explore possibilities with of relationships or attractions with people that might not necessarily in the past have been acceptable, but they're willing to say, you know what, it may not be acceptable to some people, but I feel that I want to try this particular relationship. And so I do think it is useful for us to just consider that sexuality can, in fact, be very dynamic. It who you're attracted today may not be the same type of person that you're attracted to in the future. At least I believe that, and I think these models also support that too. Uh, you see here that there has been an increase in the number of people identified as LGBTQ. Um, that is not necessarily saying that there are more people today that are LGBTQ, simply that they're actually coming out now. It is perhaps more comfortable for people to come out. Um, and we only started keeping numbers of the GLBTQ community in 2000, when the first census that counted LGBTQ individuals where they could identify was the 2000 census. And since I'm talking about the census, I want to remind you all that the 2020 census is taking place now. And if your home got one of those little mailers, take a moment or two to log on and answer the questions. It's pretty quick. I did it a couple weeks ago. It's important to do that. So what I want to skip to now are the theories that again try to understand or try to explain why some people are gay, lesbian, or bisexual. I'm going to start here with the biological theories, and this theory by Franz Kallman in 1952, who studied identical twins. And what he was trying to understand is whether there might be a genetic component to homosexuality. He wondered if genetics had anything to do with some people identifying as homosexual. And he studied identical twins because they have the exact same DNA, as you all know. And he thought that that would help him better to understand how DNA plays a role in the identification of someone as homosexual. And so here's what he did find. He did find that in siblings who were identical twins, they were more likely to share a sexual orientation. He also did find that genes, what we inherit from our parents, do account for at least half of the variance in sexual orientation. But here's the big but. His research is interesting, but one thing that we have to recognize is if homosexuality were purely genetic, then that would mean that every successive generation of homosexuals would become smaller and smaller because at least in 1952 and on through, say, the early 80s at least, there wasn't a possibility for homosexuals to have children. Today, that's possible because of in vitro fertilization and surrogate mothers, you know, in vitro fertilization, and then the mother having a surrogate mother carry the child to term. In the case of gay couple, lesbian couple, one of them could carry it. But that wasn't possible back then, and so we would have seen much smaller rates of homosexuals as time went on, and we haven't actually seen that. So it's promising, but it's not the sole answer. That is, genes may play a role here, but it's not the sole answer. There was also a point in time in the 40s and the 50s when it was believed that hormone levels might play a role. And it was believed, for example, that during prenatal development, there was some research that shows that a deficiency in certain hormones during fetal development might be the reason for some children eventually identifying as GLBTQ. It's the support for this is weak. There was also a time when it was believed that males who were gay, for example, they had lower levels of testosterone and androgen than normal. And females who identified as lesbian had lower levels of estrogen and progesterone. And so there was a time in the 40s and the 50s when gay men were given increased levels of testosterone and androgen, and lesbians were given increased levels of estrogen and progesterone, and that did not, quote, straighten anybody out. And so we know that generally is not a reason for someone identifying as GLBT or Q. Birth order is another interesting idea. There's some research that does show that there's a correlation between the number of siblings and the gender of siblings. And so, anecdotally, some of you probably have seen this yourselves in a family where there are several older sisters, and then finally there's, after the third or fourth sibling, there's a male born, that male has got a 33% chance, uh, increased chance of identifying as gay. I'm sure all of you probably know a family like that. But then there are lots of other families where the firstborn is a male and he identifies as homosexual, as gay. And so there's some correlation there, but it's not certainly something that we can say for certain, aha, this is it. Also, excuse me, the maternal immune hypothesis. This is an interesting idea, and there's no way to really test it, but that's why it's a hypothesis. It's not a theory. It's not been tested yet. It's the idea that later born sons, that is, sons who are born at the tail end of a string of births, could develop an immune response to genes that are latent in the uterus, and that might influence the gene expression during brain development. And so here's the thinking. Let's say a woman has 5 children. The last child is a male. The first 4 children are, say, females. The thinking is that with each of those births, the uterus, of course, after the placenta is expelled, the uterus retains a trace amount of hormones. And that trace amount, of course, builds up with each successive pregnancy, so that by the time she's carrying that 5th child to term, those trace amounts of the hormones that are still in the uterus from the prior births may affect the brain and how the genes are expressed during the development of the brain of that fetus. As I said, this is a hypothesis, not a theory, because theories are tested, hypotheses are not. There's no way really to test this. This is an idea, and so of course we don't really know about that one at all. I'm not a scientist, but it sounds a little, to me, illogical. But that's just me. I leave it up to you to think about your own ideas there. Physiology in the 1990s, there was a study, and it was done by a guy who's still alive. He, at the time that he did the study, was at UC Santa Barbara. I believe he still is. His name is Simon LeVay. And Simon LeVay postulated that perhaps, again, we're thinking here about the brain, because the brain, we know, does affect how we think and feel about sex. And so Simon LeVay hypothesized that the hypothalamus, and if you know about the hypothalamus, it's that little tiny piece back of the brain that regulates things such as hunger, thirst, and of course, sexual desire. And so he postulated that perhaps the hypothalamus, there's something different in the hypothalami of gay men that is, something about the hypothalami of gay men is different from the hypothalami of heterosexual men. And so he studied the hypothalami of gay men and heterosexual men. And of course, in order to study the hypothalamus, you have to study dead people. You can't just take out the hypothalamus from somebody alive and insert it later. So these were all men who had died. And it wasn't really determined whether the differences because he did see differences. He did see differences in the size of the hypothalamus in gay men. But there's no way to tell whether that size difference was present from birth or whether it developed later in life. In fact, most of the straight men that he studied, and keep in mind this was in the early 1990s when the study was done, many of the gay men that he studied had died from AIDS. And so it's hard to know if the disease AIDS affected the hypothalamus or if the hypothalamus was affected in some other way in the gay men versus the straight men. So it's an interesting idea, but one that is not conclusive. And then this one, I'm not really going to go over it. Somebody had this idea about the lengths of fingers. Very, very weak correlation. It's discussed in the text. If you want to read a little bit more about that, please feel free. Um, developmental theories. Freud, while I'm not such a great fan of his, and sometimes he does come up with something that makes some sense. These are two that I'm not particularly fond of, but if you've taken Psych 1, you know these two. Freud believed that men become homosexual due to something that he dubbed the Oedipal complex. And what he believed is that if you know about the Oedipus complex, what you know is that Freud postulated that young boys, very young boys, they become attracted, romantically attracted to their mothers, and at some point, usually around the age of 2 or 3, they recognize they cannot be with their mothers because, of course, they see their mothers with their fathers, and so what happens then is they move, if you move naturally through the Oedipus complex, as he postulated most men do, those young boys then begin to model themselves after the type of behavior that their fathers exhibit. So they model themselves after their fathers with the hope that one day they will become the they will become like their fathers, and they will then be able to attract a woman who is like their mothers. Freud argued that's the natural progression through which young boys move. He argued then that boys who don't begin to model themselves after their fathers, he argued they do not mature naturally. And so his argument was males become homosexual as a result of that unresolved Oedipal complex. Lesbians, on the other hand, he argued they move through, the Electra complex. And the Electra complex, of course, is that girls become romantically attracted to their fathers. Again, around the age of 2 or so, they realize they can't be with their fathers. And so they begin to model themselves after their mothers, again, in hopes that they will be able to attract a man someday who's like their fathers. What Freud argued is females who don't move through that process, they do not normally mature. And so he argued because they can't have their father, they reject him, and that they have anger because they don't have a penis and they blame their mother. Also, Freud viewed homosexuality as narcissistic because in his mind, it's like making love to your own body. And in his view, that's narcissism. You want to have sex with something that looks like you, someone that looks like you. Again, these are ideas that um, that exist. I will not talk badly about psychology. Sandor Rado, interesting person. He was one of the first people to suggest that homosexuality is a mental illness. And of course, this became the dominant view in American psychiatry until 1973. In fact, homosexuality was labeled a mental illness by the American Psychiatric Association, and it was listed as a mental illness in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual until 1973. And if you don't know much about psychology, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, is like the Bible for the profession. If you were to pull a copy off a shelf at a library and the Laverne Library has a copy. I looked through it when the newest version, which is the DSM-5, it's in its fifth version, came out in 2013. And I can guarantee you, if you look through there, at least in the neuroses section, you will become convinced that you have at least 3 or 4 different neuroses, because the kinds of things that are highlighted there are so common among people. But anyway, so there's a little bit of history on how the psychiatric community viewed homosexuality. And then there's Bieber, not Justin, but another Bieber researcher who makes the argument that gay men had some sort of a mother who was very intimate with the boy, shared secrets, and not just secrets about personal things, but also sexual secrets, who were quite seductive in nature. Um, and they had either absent or hostile fathers who didn't pay attention to them if they were there and were quite hostile toward them, or maybe the father wasn't there. The boy then begins to identify much, much more with the mother, he argued, and in identifying with her, begins to be sexually attracted to her. I'm sorry, not sexually attracted, begins to turn away from women, um, in and because the mother is so intimate and seductive with the boy turns away from the mother, and then becomes sexually attracted to men. Um, the interesting thing about Bieber's idea, of course, is that most of the men that he studied were his patients, of course, just like with Freud. But they didn't have that kind of family pattern that Bieber even suggested. So, and again, even just anecdotally, I'm sure that all of you know individuals who are in the GLBTQ community who do not have that kind of family pattern. Most GLBT people in the GLBTQ community I know, many of them have quite, healthy families, way less dysfunctional than my own family. So then going to theories that are much more widely accepted as having some degree of merit. Gender role nonconformity. There are some studies that do correlate this particular idea, that support this idea. The idea is that children who begin to exhibit cross-gender traits are more likely to be gay or lesbian as adults. And the idea here is that this is not a cause and effect relationship. It's not saying that if you're a tomboy when you are a child, that as a adult female, you are going to identify as lesbian. It's not saying that. That's not cause and effect. But there's some correlation here. That there are studies that suggest when you look at boys and girls in middle school, and before that in elementary school, and if you follow them through high school, those boys, those girls who engage in gender nonconforming behavior may be more likely to identify as gay or lesbian. But again, it's not saying that if you're a tomboy, if you're a boy who likes to bake cookies when you're growing up, that you're going to identify as gay or lesbian. But there's some support for this idea. Peer group interaction, this is one as well. It's, it's almost 30 years old, suggesting that children who mature a little earlier than their peers, they, of course, since they're maturing earlier than their peers, they're much more likely to be sexually aroused. But if they're playing in same-sex peer groups, then that sexual arousal is turned on to or targeted toward members of the same sex. Because they're, say, in middle school and still playing with same sex peers, if they start to feel some sort of sexual attraction or sexual desire or arousal, it's more likely because they're around peers of the same sex, which would then mean that that's who they get fixated on as their targets of arousal, versus if the sexual arousal starts to, or desire starts to happen in early high school, then you're more likely to be in um, co-ed groups. But there's not a lot of support for this idea because even throughout high school, a lot of us still have closer same-sex peer groups than we do co-ed peer groups. Now we get to the behaviorist and sociological theories. Behaviorist theories are focused on um, reinforcement and sanctions. So if you're familiar with psych, at least development, the early introductory psych classes, behavioral reinforcement theories are if you give someone reinforcement when they do the thing you want them to do, then hopefully they keep doing it, and to the point where you don't have to give them the reward anymore. They just do it because they're they've been they've been the word is skipping me right now or missing me. Uh, Socialized to do it. There's another word for it, but I'll leave it at that. On the other hand, if you give them a sanction when they do something that they're not supposed to do, again, over time, you won't have to punish them because they will have learned that they shouldn't do that thing. And so behaviorist theories argue that homosexuality could very much be due to the fact that certain types of behavior are punished, certain types of sexual attraction, sexual behavior are punished. And so people are less likely to engage in those things. And certain types of sexual behavior, sexual attraction, etc., are rewarded. And so the idea essentially is that it's learned behavior. Who we are attracted to is learned behavior. Now, that seems to make sense if we're talking about heterosexuals because so much around us in society is heteronormative and heterocentric. That is, we are shown videos or cartoons with male female characters who have an attraction to each other. Even animals are attracted to each other. Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse and Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and Daisy Duck. On the other hand, though, it doesn't really seem to explain homosexuality or people in the GLBTQ community because there aren't enough examples, at least I don't think out there, even now, that tell children, that show children positive examples of same sex couples. I mean, I know there are some out there now, but those are not widespread enough, I don't think, anyway, for us to really say that homosexuality is learned behavior. Um, Sociological theories. And of course, I think these are typically better simply because I'm a sociologist. But the idea here is that sexual orientation is learned through culture, right? It's what we see around us. It's what we are socialized is the appropriate thing for us to do. And so I believe very strongly that because we are a society that is very, very heteronormative and very heterocentric, we get socialized to believe that heterosexuality is the norm. It's the thing that's the right thing. It's the thing that's most acceptable. And because we don't learn enough about the LGBTQ community, we may look at that community as being strange or weird or some other kind of word. Um, but it is interesting to see, if we're thinking sociologically here, how over time cultures, different times in human history, homosexuality was not any different than anything else. If you think about the ancient Greeks and Romans, homosexual behavior was not uncommon, and it also wasn't viewed as a bad or terrible thing that should be punished. And so, I, thinking from a sociological perspective, to me, it's because those societies did not have this teaching that homosexual behavior is bad, evil, and wrong, therefore you should never do it, and if you do, you're a weirdo. The thinking then was, hey, if you want to do that, go ahead. Who cares? It's you and somebody else doing what you need to do. Um, in fact, we didn't even have the term homosexuality prior to the 19th century. So I think it's really, as we've seen before in chapter 1, it's that spread of Judeo-Christian belief systems that really promote this idea that homosexuality is bad, evil, and wrong. Um, and then there's interactional theory. This is by Daryl Bem, uh, was a very well-known researcher in social psychology. Um, Bem does say, look, homosexuality is very likely this complex interaction of biology, psychology, that is our psyches, and social factors. He argues that genetics and hormones and our neuroanatomy, it all contributes to our childhood temperaments, and that influences our preferences for sex typical or atypical behaviors. Um, there is, of course, limited empirical support for his idea. Um, his idea sounds interesting, but it's really, really difficult to test. For example, how do you really test neuroanatomy and how neuroanatomy contributes to childhood temperament and therefore preferences for sex typical or atypical behaviors? I think the first part is probably the most relevant. It is a complex interaction of what we inherit from our parents, our biology. It is a complex interaction between not only our biology, but our psychology, that psychological, that is our psyches, as well as our physiological, which is the neuroanatomy piece, and then, of course, our social factors. I think that much is true. Um, and then I just want to point out here um, this last piece, because you can look through and read the rest. A key um, holding by the U.S. Supreme Court, it's Obergefell versus Hodges, was decided in 2015. Um, Finally, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 2015 in this case that all states must recognize same-sex marriages. So as of June 2015, all states have to recognize same-sex marriage. However, that doesn't mean that that people in all of these states necessarily agree with or like the holding. Also want to point out this case, which is another really important case, U.S. versus Windsor. Um, Edith Windsor was married to Thea Speyer. They were married in Toronto in 2007 when same-sex marriages were legal. Windsor was Speyer died, and Speyer had served in the military. Or sorry, Speyer died, left Windsor some money, and Windsor, though, was taxed at a very high rate by the IRS because at the time they were living in New York. And the IRS at that time did not um, recognize same-sex marriage um, as legal. And so they decided, well, then you have to pay tax, not at the spousal rate, but you have to pay it at a higher rate. And so Windsor filed a lawsuit against the IRS. And in 2013, the United States Supreme Court struck down the Defense of Marriage Act. And so now, if you are a same-sex couple and one person leaves money to the other, you are allowed to inherit that as the surviving spouse, which means you don't get taxed on it, not as an heir. All right, and then I'm just going to finish up with this last piece here. A lot of people have heard of Stonewall, but not a lot of people have heard about something that happened before Stonewall. It happened in LA, and it happened at a place called the Black Cat Tavern on Sunset Boulevard on New Year's Day in 1967. If you know about Stonewall, it happened in 1968. It was a Silver Lake bar. It was known as a gay bar, and on that New Year's Eve, as the clock struck 12, and people were singing that song that people sing, the Auld Lang Syne. Plainclothes police officers that were in the crowd that night beat people and arrested 14 people, and they were charged with lewd conduct and for same-sex kissing. And so you see there that this was in 1967, February 11th, 1967, about a little over a month later, protesters took the bold step and they protested publicly outside the police, outside the bar, protesting that police raid. And so it actually was 2 years before Stonewall. So with that, I say goodbye. I'll see you guys next week, and stay safe and stay healthy. Goodbye.